Hi folks, this is Steve, and as most of you know, for years I've been on a quest to develop the world's greatest homemade pizza recipe. Now, a recipe is not simply about ingredients, but it's a combination of ingredients and technique. And I think this year's pizza is a great combination of those two elements. Anyway, here it is. Give it a try. Let me know what you think. I think it's an awesome pizza myself. Okay, the first thing you want to do is preheat the oven to around 550 degrees. Start heating the oven about half an hour before you put the pizza in. Get it good and hot. For the dough, I keep my dry and my wet ingredients separate until just before I roll out the dough. For the dry ingredients, I'll start with 1.5 cups of flour. And I add to that about 1/2 cup of cornmeal. That gives a crust sort of a Chicago crunch. I like to use bread flour as opposed to white flour. Makes for a doughier dough, but you can work with either. I don't mix the wet and dry ingredients until the yeast has had a chance to activate. So for the wet ingredients, I start with about 2/3 cup of water. Now the water should be just about 115 to 120 degrees. That's hot enough to activate the yeast, but not hot enough to kill it. We are almost right on the nose here. To that, I add a tablespoon of olive oil. Then a tablespoon of sugar, 2 teaspoons of salt. That will make the crust crispier, more like a pizza shop crust. And then I add the yeast. Now we'll stir that and just leave it like that and let the yeast activate in the liquid. Now while the yeast is activating, we can make up the sauce. Start with an 8-ounce can of tomato sauce. I prefer De Fratelli, but almost any brand will do. To that, add 1 tablespoon of olive oil, about 1/2 teaspoon of garlic powder, a scant teaspoon of oregano, a scant teaspoon of basil, and a teaspoon of parsley. You can, of course, use fresh seasonings for a richer sauce, but the dried seem to work just fine. Meantime, as you can see, we're already starting to see some action in the yeast mixture, and that's a good sign. This is when I add a light coating of olive oil to my pizza pan. I like this pan a lot. See, it's got air holes in it so that the heat gets right to the dough. Okay, it's been about 15 minutes. Let's look at the yeast solution. See how it's getting bubbly and gooey like some primordial stew? That frothiness means it's just about ready to go. We'll give the dry ingredients one final stir, and then we'll mix the wet with the dry. Once it's mixed, put the spatula aside, add a little more bread flour, and then get your hands in there. Knead the mix. Add flour as necessary to keep things from sticking, and pretty soon you're going to get a nice dough ball. We're not going to let it rise. We've already activated the yeast, so let's roll it out. So roll it out, press it out, toss it like a pro, and then lay it on the pizza pan. Now with mine, just before I put it in the oven, I sort of dance a fork over the top, punch little holes in it. That'll aerate the dough. Works on the principle of those little holes in the top of a soda cracker. It vents the dough, and that way you'll get a crispier crust. Then, just before I put the dough in the oven, I turn the oven down to about 425. That way the pizza is going to cook from the residual heat in the oven instead of from the direct heat from the burners. I par bake that crust for about 8 minutes. When it's done, it should be firm enough to lift off the pizza pan. In fact, I usually flip my dough over and then add the sauce to the crispy side. Let's put the sauce on, and then crank out some freshly grated Parmesan cheese. When it comes to the mozzarella, I never use factory shredded cheese. I usually buy just about 1 pound of fresh Wisconsin mozzarella. Then, to get a nice even melt, I shred it in my food processor. But sliced mozzarella also works, and it'll give your pizza a nice even blanket. And here, of course, you can add your own ingredients too. Finally, I garnish it with a light sprinkling of basil. Now, if you're using fresh basil, of course, don't add the basil until after the pizza has finished baking. Now, I suppose at this point you could put the pizza back in the oven and finish it there, but lately I've been experimenting with the gas grill out in the backyard. This gives your crust a certain toastiness, it gives your cheese a little bit of a smokiness, a little bit different kind of pizza. Either way, you're going to have a great pizza, but here's how you do it on the gas grill. To preheat the grill, I turn on all the burners and let it build up heat for about 5 minutes. That gets it up to about 600 degrees. And then Just before I add the pizza, I turn the 2 center burners down to low and I keep the outer burners on high. And I slide the pizza off the pan and directly onto the grill. Whether you're cooking your pizza on the grill or just putting it back in the oven, bake it for about 15 minutes or so, but check it every couple of minutes, especially toward the end. And occasionally rotate it so that the crust and cheese gets a nice even toasting. You don't want the cheese to be brown or burnt. A little toasting around the edges is fine, a little browning around the edges, but you don't want the whole pizza to be brown on top. You want that cheese to melt and get little tiny bubbles in it. Now those little tiny bubbles in the cheese and that slightly golden color are a sign that we're just about done. Now this is a good pizza. The crust is thin and crunchy. The cheese is lightly caramelized. Finally, never slice or serve your pizza right out of the oven. Let it sit for about 3 to 5 minutes so that the cheese can set up. Then it should slice easily and neatly. So what do you think, Steve? Did we get it right this time? Oh yeah. That's a perfect blend of crispy crust, buttery cheese, and a rich saucy sauce. Bravo! Excellent pizza.